Taladrin was beginning a normal day in the garden. He was casting his elf magic into the plants to grow food. Waving his fingers over the plants, he made them grow. Instantly, each plant produced a ripe number of the fruit or vegetable that it was meant to bear. Taladrin collected the foods and took them back inside his house. Among other things, he began chopping the vegetables and slicing the fruits in order to prepare breakfast. He had grabbed a small barrel and was just about ready to fetch water from the river. As soon as he opened his door, he noticed a crowd of his neighbors around the river. He was puzzled. He wondered what everyone was looking at. Hurrying over to the crowd, he pushed through to see what the commotion was about. Instantly, his heart sank. The river was dry. The elves of the forest seemed to be arguing over what happened. No one seemed to agree on what should be done to fix the problem. Taladrin loved his neighbors. They built a city in the forest by carving their houses out of trees, hills, and even some into the small mountain. Together they had accomplished many beautiful elven wonders. But in a problematic situation, this particular group of elves could hardly ever agree. So Taladrin decided to venture upstream in hopes he might discover the source of the problem. He slipped quietly out of the crowd and began his hike. The river went on for miles. Taladrin knew this. As an elf, he could travel swiftly and lightly. But even still, he traveled for hours with no sign of discovering the source of the hidden drought. He eventually came to a fork in the river. He considered a moment. He had never ventured this far upstream. He had not known that part of the river branched off in another direction. But surely enough, both his own fork and the other were dry. He wondered who else might depend on this river for water. While he looked at the fork considering, a small figure came along on the opposite side of the other fork. "Who might you be?" the figure yelled to him. "I am Taladrin," Taladrin shouted. The two continued to talk as they walked upstream the dried river. "My people depend on this river's water, at least this side of it." "My people depend on the water from this side," the shorter, stockier figure announced. "I am Gorvik." "Would you happen to know anything about where the water has gone?" Taladrin wondered. "Or what might have stopped it?" "I was going to ask you," Gorvik answered. Taladrin could not tell exactly what kind of person Gorvik was. "Hold on," he declared. "Let me cross over." As soon as he said it, he made his way to the other side of the dried-up river. Nearing Gorvik, he noticed his features for the first time. "An elf?" Gorvik stated. "I should have known. The name Taladrin should have told me." "Of all the rotten luck," Taladrin announced. "It just makes sense that I would meet a dwarf on the day the river dries up." "How about you get back on your own side of the river?" Gorvik suggested. "I will stay on whichever side of the river I like," Taladrin stated. "Fine!" Gorvik accepted. As an elf, Taladrin had never liked dwarves. They were unclean, unbathed, and in so many other ways a disgusting people. Gorvik felt similarly about elves. They always seemed to think they were somehow better than everyone else, arrogant and judgmental. And those were the best qualities of an elf. However, as of this moment, I would prefer to be on the other side of the river, Taladrin told Gorvik as he leapt back over. The two walked in silence, but they walked seemingly together, both of them eager to discover the source of their dry river problem. "Stop following me!" they would yell at each other from time to time. "I'm simply walking. Stop following me!" And the two proceeded to hate each other at the top of their lungs. Eventually, the two came to a mountain range. How would you suppose to proceed from here? Taladrin wondered to Gorvik. You need my help now, do you? Gorvik accused. I do not need the help of a dwarf, Taladrin defended. I am merely open for suggestions. Well, there are only so many options, Gorvik summed up. Could take the chance that the cave leads straight through to the other side. Could try to climb. Could walk through the riverbed. The river is too deep, and the slides are muddy, Taladrin observed. We would never be able to climb back out. Grf! Gorvik grunted. True. I will take my chances with the cave. Somehow I find myself agreeing with you, Taladrin stated. Maybe you have some sense after all, the dwarf commented. Luckily for them, the cave led through to the other side of the mountains. It was dark walking through, but they made it. The two of them ran into several more obstacles, but eventually they found the problem. There was a huge boulder damming the river. Well, obviously we have to move that, Gorvik said. How do you figure that? Taladrin taunted. Don't mock me, elf, the dwarf yelled. Now, shall I go first, or do you have some elven trick you want to try? Be my guest, Taladrin told him. Alrighty then. Gorvik marched toward the rock. He drew his hammer from his belt and began pounding on the boulder. Little by little, the stone began to chip away. But at the rate he was going, it would have taken Gorvik years to finish reducing the giant stone. Taladrin began to lose patience. Why not try another tool? The elf suggested. Gorvik thought to himself for a moment. Well, I could try the pickaxe, he admitted. He switched tools, and process began to speed up some. Still, Taladrin lost patience. Let me a try, he demanded. Go on, then! Gorvik tossed him the pickaxe. After a while, he had gotten nowhere, so Gorvik took the pickaxe back. He only took a couple of swings before a new idea came into his head. What's that on your belt there? He asked Taladrin. Short sword? This? It is a common elven tool. Let me see it. No. Just... Why? Taladrin wondered. Just let me show you! Gorvik bellowed. Reluctantly, Taladrin threw him the object. Gorvik examined it for a moment. It was not a short sword. It was a strange-looking thin metal bar with a sharpened point. There were a few more details to the object, but Gorvik did not understand them, nor did he care to. Gorvik took the bar, placing the sharpened point into the boulder, and drew his hammer back out. With all his dwarven might, he swung the hammer, slamming it into the elven rod. The rock split. Slowly, the water began to leak through the crack. The two were watching it, when suddenly the entire boulder burst apart, and the river flowed once again. I've done it! Gorvik shouted. 2 seconds later, the water stopped again. Now that could be a problem, Taladrin stated. Gorvik turned to face what he was looking at. Oh! He reacted. Well, that explains it now, doesn't it? If the two were looking at a golem who had just slammed another boulder into the river. If we want the water back, we're going to have to deal with that stone giant, Taladrin decided. And how might you have figured that one out? Gorvik asked him. Where do we begin? Taladrin wondered. Neither of us could fight it on our own. I don't believe I've ever seen one before, Gorvik admitted. I know neither of us will like it, but we have to work together, Taladrin suggested. Did you have a plan in mind? Gorvik asked. Not yet, the elf admitted. Why suggest ridiculous ideas with no plan? Gorvik demanded. Do you have a better idea? Taladrin inquired. That wasn't even a whole idea, the dwarf protested. Then why don't you finish it? Taladrin suggested. What? As you did before, the elf continued. With your hammer and my... I don't care what it was, Gorvik interrupted. All right, just let me think. Do at least try, Taladrin commented. Gorvik ignored the insult. Well, one of us could distract him, the dwarf began. That would be me, Taladrin stated. And what makes you think that? The dwarf bellowed. I am faster, lighter on my feet, and more agile than you. You are stronger and can hit harder. The roles seem obvious, do they not? I suppose you have a point there, the dwarf agreed. All right then. You get the thing's attention while I figure out a way to blast it apart, or something like that. The dwarf began grumbling to himself. Taladrin ran in front of the golem. He was glad to see the big thing look his way. He arced around to see if the golem's head would follow his motion. It did. He began running and leaping in all sorts of patterns to attempt to confuse the stone giant. Gorvik thought about what he had in hand. His hammer, the stupid twig from Taladrin, a chain that he had forged, and that was it. He cursed at the lack of tools. But then suddenly he had an idea. Dwarven chain was known for being stronger than stone. Gorvik looped the elven rod through the chain and pounded it onto the boulder with his hammer. He now had the chain staked and wrapped around the boulder. Carefully, he held the chain in the direction that he saw Taladrin leading the golem. At first, he thought about trying to trip the golem. Then he realized he was far too light to hold the golem's weight. So when the golem walked into the chain, he circled around the thing, wrapping its huge legs in the chain. Taladrin saw what he was doing and took over for him. An elf could perform the task more quickly and efficiently. Gorvik made his way back to the boulder in the river. He waited to be sure that Taladrin had finished securing the chain to the leg. Once he was sure, he pounded with all his might to drive the rod into the boulder. The boulder cracked, just like the last one had. Within moments, the water had burst the rock apart. With the chain still wrapped tightly around the pieces, it was yanked by the force of the current. The golem was yanked into the river as well by the chain, where it was pulled apart by the force of the water. Yes! Gorvik shouted. The water is back! Taladrin smiled. The two didn't say much to each other walking back. Walking for hours, they finally came back to the fork. Well, Taladrin offered, I could not have done it without you. I don't much like elves, but you aren't half bad, the dwarf complimented. We make a good team. That we do, Taladrin agreed. The two took a moment to lock into a firm handshake before they turned and parted ways to return home.